In 1984, in a quiet Wisconsin town, a teenager set out on foot after a night with friends. She never came home. What followed was a crime so brutal, it haunted the community for decades, until modern science finally uncovered the truth. December in Saukville, Wisconsin, meant snow-covered yards, quiet streets, and the small-town comfort where everyone seemed to know everyone else. In 1984, Saukville was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and teenagers felt safe walking home after a night with friends. For 18-year-old Traci Lynn Hammerberg, that winter was meant to be filled with possibility. A high school senior with her whole life ahead of her, she was known for her bright personality, her warm smile, and the way she could make friends with anyone. She loved music, laughing with friends, and dreaming about the future. Her family described her as fun-loving, independent, and full of life. A girl with plans, with a future she was only beginning to explore. But all of that would change on one fateful December night. On Friday night, December 14th, Traci had been out with friends at a house party. There was nothing unusual about it. Just teens gathering, talking, sharing drinks, and enjoying the freedom that came with being young. By midnight, many of her friends had gone home, but Traci lingered, laughing and chatting. Around 12:30 a.m., she made the decision to head home on foot. Her destination wasn't far, just a few miles. In a close-knit town, it didn't seem dangerous. For Traci, the walk was familiar. Quiet streets, the crunch of snow under her boots, her breath rising in the cold air. But somewhere along that path, someone crossed into her world. Someone who would ensure she never made it home. Witnesses later recalled seeing Traci that night, bundled against the cold, making her way through the quiet town. She never appeared afraid. She had no reason to be. It was Saukville, safe, familiar, hers. But in the frozen stillness of that December night, a predator was waiting. Whether it was a chance encounter or something more sinister, no one could know at the time. What is known is that Traci would never reach her door, never return to the warmth of her home, never live to see another sunrise. By dawn, she was gone. The following morning, December 15th, 1984, the silence of the town shattered. Traci's body was discovered in the driveway of a home in Grafton, just 4 miles from her own. It was a random location, not connected to her, not connected to her family. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. The brutality of the crime stunned investigators and horrified the community. Who could have done this? Why here? And why to her? In an instant, Saukville was transformed. The safe, quiet streets no longer felt secure. Parents held their children tighter. Teenagers who once walked home without fear now asked for rides. The innocence of a small Wisconsin town had been shattered, and the search for answers had only just begun. Traci Lynn Hammerberg was only 18 years old when her life was stolen. What happened to her that night would remain a mystery for decades, and the hunt for her killer would lead investigators down countless dark paths, before the truth finally emerged 35 years later. By sunrise on December 15, 1984, the reality of the crime set in. Police arrived at the scene in Grafton, a neighboring town just 4 miles from Saukville. The body of 18-year-old Traci Lynn Hammerberg lay in a driveway, partially clothed, in the bitter Wisconsin cold. The scene was haunting. Fresh snowfall framed a trail of footprints, tire tracks, and signs of a violent struggle. It was the kind of crime Grafton police rarely encountered, let alone one involving a young girl from the community. For investigators, every detail mattered. But one fact stood out most. Traci had no known connection to the residence where she was found. It wasn't her home. It wasn't a friend's. It seemed random, almost deliberate, as if she had been brought there by force or left there to be found. 1984 was long before modern forensic science. DNA technology, so common today, was still years away. Investigators relied on traditional evidence: blood, fingerprints, fibers, and eyewitness accounts. At the scene, they collected Traci's clothing and personal belongings, samples from the assault, and impressions of tire marks in the snow. They also noted the position of her body, evidence suggesting she had been attacked elsewhere and left at the driveway. Though the evidence seemed overwhelming, the technology of the time limited how much could actually be analyzed. Still, police knew this was no random accident. This was targeted, violent, and personal. The investigation quickly expanded. Detectives interviewed friends who had seen Traci at the party the night before. They retraced her last steps, the route she had taken, the people she had spoken to, and anyone who might have crossed paths with her in those final moments. Early suspicion fell on local men who had been at the party. Police questioned several, probing into their whereabouts and alibis. The brutality of the crime suggested rage, and often investigators begin with those closest to the victim. But each lead hit a dead end. Alibis checked out, timelines didn't match, and frustratingly, no single suspect stood out. As news of the murder spread, Saukville and Grafton were shaken. Small towns thrived on familiarity, but now neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Parents drove their children to school instead of letting them walk. Rumors ran rampant. Was it a drifter? A jealous ex-boyfriend? Someone who had stalked Traci from the party? The newspapers reported the case daily, labeling it a brutal, unsolved slaying. For Traci's family, grief was compounded by uncertainty. Not knowing who had done this or why left them trapped in fear and confusion. Detectives worked around the clock. They chased tips, interviewed anyone connected to Traci, and followed every possible lead. Dozens of men were questioned, from local acquaintances to complete strangers who had been in the area that night. Evidence from the crime scene was processed, but without DNA analysis, investigators could only compare samples in limited ways. Even the FBI was consulted, offering behavioral profiles that suggested the killer was someone familiar with the area. A man capable of violence. A man who blended in. But despite their efforts, the case stalled. Weeks turned into months, then into years. By the late 1980s, Traci's murder had grown cold. It remained open. Detectives revisited it periodically, hoping new information would surface. But as time passed, other crimes demanded attention. Evidence sat in storage. Witness memories faded. Leads dried up. For the Hammerberg family, every anniversary was a painful reminder that justice had not been served. Each December, they were forced to relive the night Traci never came home. The murder of Traci Lynn Hammerberg left a town paralyzed with fear and investigators searching in vain for answers. Despite exhaustive efforts, the trail grew cold. The case files sat in darkness, waiting. What no one knew then was that hidden in the evidence lay the truth, but science had not yet caught up to reveal it. For 35 years, the murder of Traci Lynn Hammerberg haunted Saukville and Grafton like a ghost that refused to rest. Every December, the town was reminded of its darkest night. Police officers who had once worked the case retired, some passing the files to younger detectives. Each new generation of investigators opened the boxes of evidence, photographs, reports, and carefully sealed biological samples, and felt the weight of a question that had tormented their predecessors. Who killed Traci? But year after year, the answer remained buried in silence. By the 2000s, technology had caught up with what investigators had always hoped for: DNA profiling. The biological evidence collected from the crime scene, which had been preserved in storage for decades, was finally tested using modern methods. Analysts extracted a DNA profile, the genetic fingerprint of the killer. It was a huge step forward. Yet, when investigators ran the DNA through CODIS, the National Database of Convicted Offenders and Arrestees, the results were disappointing. No matches. The killer was not in the system. For the Hammerberg family, hope flickered again, only to dim just as quickly. Then came a new frontier: forensic genealogy. This revolutionary method was first made famous in 2018, when investigators used it to identify the notorious Golden State Killer after decades of mystery. The process involved uploading an unknown suspect's DNA profile to public genealogy databases, sites like GEDmatch, where people submitted their DNA to find relatives. By searching for partial matches, investigators could build out family trees and work their way to a suspect. In 2019, investigators turned to this method for Traci's case. After decades of frustration, the once stalled investigation was suddenly moving again. When the DNA was uploaded, investigators found distant relatives, cousins, second cousins, people who had no idea their genetic material would play a role in solving a murder mystery. With help from genealogists, detectives painstakingly pieced together family connections. Slowly, the branches of the tree pointed them toward a name: Philip Cross. It was a breakthrough that sent chills through the investigative team. Cross wasn't a stranger to the area. In fact, in 1984, he had lived in Port Washington, just a few miles from where Traci's body was found. But here was the twist. Philip Cross was no longer alive. He had died in 2012 at age 66, never facing justice, never revealing his dark secret. Investigators now had to prove that the DNA belonged to him. They obtained DNA from his surviving family members and compared it. The results were conclusive. Philip Cross was the man who had killed Traci Lynn Hammerberg. Cross had a troubling history. Court records revealed a man with a violent streak, known to have a drinking problem, and arrests for disorderly conduct and assault. But he had never been convicted of anything serious enough to land his DNA in Cody's. He had slipped through the cracks of the justice system, blending into the background of small-town life. For decades, he carried the secret of what he had done to Traci. And then he died without ever being held accountable. In 2019, nearly 35 years after the crime, law enforcement stood before cameras to deliver the news. They announced that through forensic genealogy, they had identified Traci's killer, Philip Cross. Though he would never stand trial, the case was considered closed. For Traci's family, it was bittersweet. Justice had come, but far too late. They would never hear Cross explain why. They would never see him sentenced. But at last, they knew the truth. For 35 years, the answer had been there, locked inside a single strand of DNA, hidden in the bloodstains, preserved through time, waiting for science to catch up. And when it did, the secret unraveled. The man who ended Traci's life was no longer alive. But in the silence of his grave, his guilt was written into his genes. The question remained, why? Why would a 66-year-old man attack a teenage girl walking home on a cold December night? The answer would prove as elusive as justice itself. Identifying Philip Cross as the killer should have brought closure. Yet for many, it opened an even deeper wound. Cross was dead. He could not be questioned, could not be confronted, could not be forced to explain the brutal choices he made that December night in 1984. And so, the most haunting question remained: why did he kill Traci Lynn Hammerberg? Investigators could only speculate. Traci had been walking home alone, vulnerable in the cold darkness. Cross lived nearby. Was it an opportunity? A predator waiting for a victim? Or had he seen her at the party earlier that night, perhaps even followed her? Some locals whispered that Cross might have known of Traci, that in small-town Wisconsin, paths often crossed in subtle ways. The truth was unknowable. Without Cross alive to speak, the murder's motive was sealed away forever. Though Cross was never convicted of a serious violent crime, his record painted a troubling picture. Arrests for disorderly conduct, alcohol abuse, an aggressive streak, a man described as unstable, unpredictable, and often drunk. Neighbors recalled him as a man you didn't want to cross paths with on a bad night. Still, no one could have imagined him capable of such brutality. But then again, the warning signs were scattered, small fragments of violence that, in hindsight, pointed toward something darker. For the Hammerberg family, the news in 2019 was bittersweet. After 35 years, they finally had a name. But closure is not the same as justice. They would never see Cross in a courtroom, never hear him admit guilt, never watch a judge sentence him for destroying their daughter's life. Instead, they were left with silence. And in that silence, grief echoed louder than ever. Traci's siblings spoke of how the murder shaped their lives, how every milestone, every holiday, every family event was shadowed by her absence. Her parents had died before the case was solved, never knowing the truth. For them, justice came too late. Even the community felt the sting of unfinished justice. For decades, suspicion had swirled. People had quietly wondered if it was someone they knew, A neighbor, a coworker, maybe even a friend. Now they knew the truth. But instead of relief, there was unease. Philip Cross had lived among them. He had passed them in grocery stores, stood beside them at gas stations, shared sidewalks with their children. And all the while, he carried the memory of what he had done to Traci. The mystery of motive wasn't the only lingering question. There were other what-ifs. What if DNA technology had arrived sooner? Could Cross have been caught in the 1990s, still alive to face trial? What if Cross had struck again? Was Traci his only victim, or had he harmed others who never came forward? And perhaps most painfully, what if Traci hadn't left the party alone? These unanswered questions turned the case into more than a solved crime. It became a chilling reminder of how fragile justice can be, and how some truths remain forever out of reach. Philip Cross's name closed the case, but it did not close the wounds. The why was gone with him, the chance for justice buried in his grave. And for the Hammerberg family, answers that arrived too late were no answers at all. For Traci Lynn Hammerberg, the truth finally came to light, but the darkness around why it happened will never fade. In 2019, law enforcement declared the case of Traci Lynn Hammerberg closed. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. Philip Cross was the man who brutally ended her life on that December night in 1984. But unlike most crime stories, there would be no trial, no sentencing, no final confrontation in a courtroom. The killer was gone, his secrets buried with him. For police, it was a success. One of the coldest cases in Wisconsin's history, solved through the perseverance of detectives and the miracle of science. For the Hammerberg family, it was closure that came far too late. Traci's case wasn't just another solved murder. It became part of a new era of forensic science. The use of genetic genealogy to identify Cross was groundbreaking at the time, following in the footsteps of the Golden State Killer case. Proved that no matter how much time had passed, DNA carried the truth. Detectives across the country began to revisit their own cold cases, asking, could this work for us? Could we finally give answers to families who had been waiting for decades? In a way, Traci's tragedy helped pioneer a wave of justice for others. Her story showed that even in the face of decades of silence, the truth can still be pulled from the shadows. But at the heart of this story is not science or police work or even Philip Cross. At its heart is Traci Lynn Hammerberg, an 18-year-old girl with a radiant smile, an open heart, and a future stolen from her. Friends remembered her as a free spirit, fun-loving and kind. She loved music, loved laughter, and had a way of making people feel seen. Her life was only just beginning. Instead of college graduations, careers, or family milestones, her memory lived in newspaper clippings and crime files for 35 long years. When the case was finally closed, vigils were held. Candles were lit in her honor. Her name was spoken not in whispers of tragedy, but in love, a reminder that she was not just a victim, but a daughter, a friend, and a young woman whose life mattered. In interviews, Traci's surviving siblings expressed gratitude to investigators who never gave up, but their words carried the weight of heartbreak. Her parents had passed away before the case was solved, never knowing who killed their daughter. That truth, the fact that justice arrived too late for them to hear, was perhaps the most painful detail of all. Still, they took comfort in knowing the truth was finally revealed. No more rumors, no more wondering. The name was known, and with that name, the Hammerberg family could begin, at last, to grieve in peace. Traci's case has become part of a much larger conversation. How far should we go with forensic genealogy? What does it mean for privacy, for the use of public DNA databases, for ethics? But for many families, those questions are secondary to the simple fact that the technology works. It brings answers where once there was only silence. For the community of Saukville and Grafton, it was proof that justice may be delayed, but it does not have to be denied. For 35 years, the case of Traci Lynn Hammerberg was a story of violence unanswered, a question left hanging in the cold Wisconsin air. Today, we know the name of her killer, but more importantly, we remember her name, Traci Lynn Hammerberg. She is more than a case file. She is a life that mattered. And though the shadows of December 1984 will never fully fade, her light still shines.